Welcome to Healing Broken Trust Podcast. I'm Morgan Robinson.
And I am Brad Robinson.
And today we're talking about grief. So Brad, do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Sure. One of the things that we're talking about, like Morgan mentioned, is grief and basically how that plays a role in the healing process after an affair, after trust has been broken. And Morgan, the shocking thing is, I think as a culture we recognize, okay, you've been cheated on. There's going to be a lot of hurt, a lot of anger. Sometimes there's even, some cultures allow people they kind of get a little benefit of the doubt if there's kind of a crime of passion, like you find out your spouse has cheated on you, and if you go crazy, or insane, you get, you may have a
be
less
pardoned
or yeah. But the reality is that both people are really grieving. Both people are, I would argue, really grieving and traumatized by the affair. Obviously, that may come later for the one who's involved. Sometimes they have trust issues with their partner that they cheated on. And so they don't, the affair is discovered, they don't just come out and aren't immediately remorseful. Sometimes they are. You hope they are, but that's not always the case because they've sometimes have their own issues with the relationship that they've begun to grieve that causes them or makes them more vulnerable to seeking out an affair or participating in an affair. And so basically, we've talked a lot about PTSD in earlier episodes, and PTSD or trauma is just a fancy name for deep emotional wounds. And when we have deep emotional wounds, oftentimes we're going to go through a grief-like response, a grief process. This grief that people go through, and we're going to talk about the 5 stages of grieving. I've got some info I want to share that I think is really powerful, and so we're going to go through that. Basically, when people are grieving, it's for the one who's betrayed has this process, the one who's involved in the affair has this grieving process, and it's a little different for everybody. And I just jotted down some notes of what I tend to see in my office. And then I'm going to dive into the research, and then I'm going to dive into defining these 5 stages of grief. And so this is kind of what I've noticed in my office, just some notes, then we'll get to the research, and then description of the 5 stages. Oftentimes this grief that I've seen, people are asking, it's really how they thought their life was going to turn out for themselves. I remember being in high school, realizing one day I'm going to get married, have my own family, and thinking, you know what, this is for life, and, I'm only going to do it once, and I'm going to have a great childhood. I'm going to give my kids a great childhood, and I'm going to have a great marriage. A lot of people have that same thought, and when that doesn't happen, you grieve that thought. You grieve that hope. You grieve that dream.
Those expectations.
And the reasonable expectations to have. Like, it's not stupid to think, hey, we're going to be happily married, and we're going to have a great family, and our children are going to grow up healthy and happy. And so when you see, your marriage, when there's an affair or infidelity,
or some other attachment injury,
or some other relationship injury that creates trust, it really, you begin to grieve that. You begin to kind of get sad about, this is what I hoped we would have. And then, you get sad for your kids too. Gosh, this is not what I wanted to give them. My parents went through something similar. Now I'm repeating the past. I don't want to give my kids this. Another part of this is sometimes it's not always our decision to go, or we didn't make this decision. It was made for us. And, it's like a layoff. You were with this company, you're in your 50s, you're planning on retiring, it's got a few more years you got to put in, and then you get laid off. There's going to be a grieving process with that because there's these expectations that you're going to be taken care of. As long as you do your part, things are going to be okay. And unfortunately, that's not always how it works. But there's that grieving process.
Right. Maybe your spouse left you. And
your spouse left you.
Have no choice in the matter.
Absolutely. One of the things I see, and it's always hard when you lose something because that's why we grieve. Is there's trauma, a deep emotional wound. We're also grieving because there's a loss. There's a profound sense of sadness there. I'm just looking on Facebook Live. We got a comment. So you guys listening on the podcast, that's where my mind went for a second. I'm sorry to hear that. That's where someone is saying that's where they're at right now. And so there's a real grief in this. And, there's a grief around, I think any stage you are in your marriage, you're going to have this profound grief where you're going to have a grief around
What could have been.
What could have been. You're going to have a grief around, especially if you're young, newly married, you're going to have a grief around like, gosh, I waited to get married and then this happened to me. Or, we've been married for 30 years and we're planning on retirement and then you leave me for this other person. Those are all horrible situations to be in. And so part of grieving is you want to get a support group that can help you with it. I'm always going to favor the idea of working with professionals, but friends who've gone through similar things, who are supportive of your marriage if you're choosing to stay married. You want to work with people who are friends of the marriage if that's your goal, is to stay married. Because oftentimes when we talk to our friends or family about marital issues, they tend to, we oftentimes are only describing our spouse in the negative cycle. We're describing our mate in the negative cycle. And so if we're describing our mate, we're describing things that they hurt us with. And so sometimes if they don't understand, these things can sometimes work both ways. They don't have a, framework with that.
They don't have context.
They don't have context for some of these things. They tend to think you're married to a narcissist.
Yeah.
You ought to go ahead and leave. You'd be much happier. And so you want to work with somebody who's a friend of the marriage because, go ahead.
And they often are protective of you naturally as well.
Yes,
so they have a bias.
Yes.
A family member or friend sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's this sense of grief that is there. And you're going to have that whether you've been married, whether you're engaged to this person, whether you're just dating, whether it's going to be different levels. And the more you had a life with this person, the more grief there's going to be. So if they, so that doesn't really mean like time-wise. I think that does play a factor in the grief. But, the more they were part of your daily life, if they leave, the more that you do with them.
More invested that you guys were in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. But also there's that expectation you're not going to cheat on me. People don't assume that typically in a relationship that it's going to happen. And when it does, there's a profound sense of grief. Yeah. One of the things that's, when no matter what kind of an affair happens or where at in your relationship, whether in the beginning, middle, or, when you have an older relationship, you've been married for 20, 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, you're going to kind of always question what you thought you had, especially if it happens in the beginning of a relationship. I worked with countless couples where one partner has an affair, whether we're dating or an affair while in the first couple of years of marriage. The other person doesn't know. Oftentimes in those kinds of scenarios, when they don't know, they find out later.
They assumed that you were committed to them, and then it turns out you weren't, or they weren't.
Yeah. Well, it gets tricky because it's, I saved myself, you didn't. And then sometimes they have regrets about getting married. I didn't, if I had known this, I wouldn't have. And part of their grief is that their choice was robbed from them. And that's part of why being honest is so important, because when we're honest and we disclose information and necessary details about an affair, is we're giving that person the right to make up their mind if they want to stay or go. And so sometimes people feel really betrayed and they really regret staying married or even getting married when they feel like their choice was made for them. And so they're not fully informed about, being cheated on, and then later if they do find out, obviously they're very upset, they're very mad, and there's a real anger there and a real disgust for that person that cheated on them because their choice was taken from them. And so they have a real disgust, they have real anger.
Do you feel like when their choice is taken, do you mean like, say, children, like they got pregnant and felt compelled to get married kind of thing? That choice? Is that what you mean?
No, more like they feel like you didn't give me all the relevant facts.
Oh, and I married you with an assumption that this and this, but then I learned this.
It's like finding out you have a criminal past. You spent time in jail.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I didn't know that, and now I've hitched my wagon to yours. Yeah,
we've been married for 15 years.
And I wouldn't have dated you. You wouldn't even have been somebody I would have dated. I remember I had a client once who was kind of in the public eye, and he said, if I had known this stuff about you, and she didn't cheat on him, but he just said, I wouldn't have dated you. I couldn't have dated somebody like you had I known this before we even got into a relationship. So it was part of his grieving process. It's just like, I wouldn't have done this had I known all the relevant facts, had I known who you really were, who you really are. And so oftentimes that makes grief more complicated because you don't quit loving somebody just because they hurt you or cheated on you.
Or lied to you.
Or lied to you. You don't stop loving them. You get really angry with them. You get really ticked off with them, but you don't necessarily stop loving them. And so that's kind of, that can make grief hard. And, at the end, something that I see that makes grief hard, you just shared a whole life with somebody. Kids are getting older, maybe you're empty nesters, and then you find out about it. If you find out about it at the beginning, you tend to think, what kind of marriage have we really had? Who have you really been? When else did you do it to me? And then if it happens kind of later in life when there hadn't been any previous trust issues, but they decide to leave anyway, it's very complicated because, as we get older, we have less friends typically. We usually have. Our social circle gets smaller, and it's with our family. We do make plans to be with our mate and, maybe travel or do other stuff with them. And then when they say, I don't want to do that anymore, I'm leaving you for someone else, it's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, definitely.
So as we kind of go on, I want to go through some of this research, Morgan.
Okay.
One of the things, just with the grief, I'm looking at my notes, so you guys on Facebook can see this.
While he's looking, if you have a question, please let us know in the comments, and we can see them. They're actually really easy to see. So if you have a question, please feel free to ask away.
Yeah. So here we go. So basically, what the research says is that the person who's been hurt, they generally there obviously is a feeling of betrayal. There's a sense that boundaries around the relationship have been violated. So there's obviously, if you've been betrayed, you feel there's a strong feeling of violation. You've taken something from me without asking. You've taken something major from me without asking. There's a breach of trust that's been broken. Obviously, there's going to be a pattern of secrecy with most affairs. And lies about the infidelity itself, that's something that people grieve. Is like, you didn't trust me enough to come talk to me about this. You didn't trust me enough that you felt like we could work through this, but you kept it hidden all this time. There's also feelings of emotional turmoil. There's confusion, disbelief, anger, resentment, disillusionment, fear, helplessness, depression, hopelessness, and a profound sense of loss. And when people have been betrayed by their mate, this profound sense of loss tends to revolve the feelings of innocence. Our relationship is safe. You're the person I can always go to and talk to and count on and lean on. The sense of emotional safety is lost. Sense of trust. Sometimes, I see this a lot in my office. Oftentimes people get married to the only person, a lot of people never had anybody they could really count on emotionally growing up. They never had anybody that was really there for them. And so it's really hard when you're betrayed by the only person you thought you could trust. Mom and dad, couldn't trust them. Was hurt by others in the past. But I married you, and I thought you were the only one I could trust. I thought you were an honest person. I thought you were a person of integrity. Then you cheat on me. And your whole, that's a major grief. That complicates the grieving process.
I think it's really interesting. It says the loss of innocence, like we grieve our loss of innocence. Or, I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, because now we're that couple who's had this, and Morgan, here's the thing that people grieve a lot is, I'll never look at you the same way again.
Yeah.
I'll never look at you as somebody that, you had my back, you was there for me. So that's something that people grieve.
But they can get that back, right? Like over time?
Yeah, they definitely can. Yeah. I've talked about this couple a lot. I've had other couples like this, but they always stand out to me because they were the first I had. The first time I ever had this. And so, kind of the first time we ever experienced anything, it's the one that probably sticks with us. But I've had, obviously other couples. But this was, if you've been listening to our podcast for a while, I've talked about these guys where The husband got caught with one affair, but he ended up having like 8 or 9 other affairs. Finally discloses it. The wife is livid, ticked off. She's saying he's evil. You know, who is this guy? You know, and then he, a few months later, she's saying, you know, he's really a great husband. He's really a great dad. So she went from like someone who's evil to this, you know, great person. And so yeah, you can get that back. But that's something people grieve: is, can I ever see you differently? Can I ever see you the way I thought you were?
Can I let you back in ever again?
Yeah, and then there's a loss of trust, obviously. Then there's also those are things about the other person.
Yeah.
But then there's also the grief about
the
loss of self-respect.
Like purpose. What is my purpose now?
Yeah, like what's, you know, what are we going to do now?
Yeah.
Like, you know, what's
who am I and who are you?
Yeah, who am I now? I'm somebody that let this happen. Obviously, there's a loss of self-respect. A lot of people who get betrayed feel like something must be wrong with me. That's why you did this.
What did I do to deserve
what did I do?
this?
How, you know, I must be extremely inadequate for you to think that you could do this to me and feel like you would never get caught. And so other researchers go on to say that, you know, there's obviously, you know, people are grieving the idea of what the relationship was and what it represented. I think we've kind of already covered that. You know, there's a sense of loss about who are you? You know, there's a feeling of, I'll read directly from the research article. It says there's a sense of loss around the experience, as though one doesn't have the foggiest idea of who they are married to, of who their mate is, and so there's this who are you feeling, and that's part of trauma, is this shattered assumptions. It's who are you? Can I ever trust who you are? Can I ever get to know who you are? And so that's an extreme thing. It's like finding out that you're like thinking of somebody that you respect, like Robin Williams. You know, growing up in the 80s. You know, I got a birthday coming up, and so parents divorce, and Mrs. Doubtfire was a movie that I probably watched all the time. And that movie was all about, you know, a divorced family and a dad's attempts to be a part of that family again. And he goes to some really extreme measures. And it's in a lot of ways, it's a very mature movie for kids because of the subject matter. And so Robin Williams was a genie in the lab, Mrs. Doubtfire. Even remember seeing like Dead Poet Society as a kid. That's, you know, and then like Good Morning Vietnam. Probably shouldn't have been watching that one. Other movies that he did, like Patch Adams. He did other movies, Toys. But then to find out the guy died, and especially the way he passed, you know, it was very tragic, and he had some health issues. I don't know if I've ever come around with that yet.
To feel better about it?
Well, you know, I haven't like addressed it. Like, you know, it's not like, it's very easy to compartmentalize. And it's like, oh, it's a celebrity. It's the first time a celebrity passing has ever really impacted me.
Well, I didn't realize that he really had a huge impact in that way, because that was a big time in her life.
Wow.
You know, and that was a definitely an impactful movie.
Yeah, it was a good movie. Yeah. It was a funny movie, but you know, it can't throw me off now.
Sorry,
it's okay. And so, you know, part of this is
the grief.
Well, it's easy to like, okay, it's a celebrity.
Sure.
You know, I remember it happened on a Monday when I found out, and this is embarrassing.
No, it's okay.
But I was still upset by Wednesday. Found out Monday. I'm so upset by it by Wednesday, and I'm embarrassed. And I'm even sad that he passed away, because it's like Robin Williams was somebody I could always, you know, it wasn't a vital part of my life, but he was somebody that was, you know, funny and
almost like a friend.
Well, you know, not even say that, but just like he was the guy that, you know, lifted America up, and then he passes away, and it and so there's this kind of who are you really? You know, when you have this grief process. And so for me, it's like, I guess Robin was really funny, but who was he really? And, you know, as information's come out, turns out he had Parkinson's disease, and he had, you know, really impacted him in a significant way. But that's what we go through when we are grieving, is who are you? Who is this person? And, you know, who am I committed to? The one who's been injured, may have serious doubts about their own sense of self. They may feel like, gosh, I no longer know who I am. You did this to me. Who am I now? You betrayed me in this way. And then all these losses can accumulate to a point where there's a loss regarding the future, feeling completely uncertain about the future, insecure about the future, and where the future can become really frightening. And those are definitely, that's a traumatic response to grief that people go through. But for the one who had the affair, there's also, and I would say this is extremely true, the research is showing this, I would say this is very true, when I work with couples, unless they're still in love with the affair partner, and I need to be careful to say that, because sometimes people think, like, you're not having the reaction I want you to have, so you must still be involved in the affair. A lot of people who have an affair, they just aren't in touch with their emotions, and so they don't always grieve the same ways that we think they should. We knew a guy, and somebody was describing him, that when he's excited, you wouldn't even know he's excited.
Yeah.
Because when he's excited, there's no
like affect.
There's no affect. There's no body language. It shows that he's really excited or really happy.
Yeah, with me, I'm
and maybe for the average person you can tell, but for people who really keep their emotions under guard, you may not really know they're grieving. Instead, what you may see is them, we've talked a lot about primary emotions, where you may see them maybe really sad, maybe really be feeling very ashamed of themselves and not good enough. But what often happens is they feel, what you're going to see is oftentimes anger. And that's definitely part of the grieving process that we'll get into. They may have anger, they may have, just withdrawn, shut down, avoidance.
You just sort of disappear.
Yeah, frustrated a lot, real short, snippy, that kind of thing. And so we have a question from Facebook. We'll get into that in a moment.
Yes. Okay.
And so, but for the one who was involved, that's the thing I was going to say is I see a lot of these guys and girls, when they have an affair, they're also in a tremendous amount of pain too. It's, how could I do this to you? How could I hurt you in this way? It's like being the cause of an accident where, a close loved one dies. There's tons of self-hatred, tons of self-blame. And the irony is if you can share that self-hatred, self-blame, that feeling of stupidity and embarrassment, your own grief about how you did this to your mate, how you betrayed your mate, if you can share it with the one you betrayed, it actually helps them heal as well. Mm-hmm. You're grieving together. I did this to you, I'm sorry, I can't believe I did it, what was I thinking? And often what we try to do is we try to bury that, and minimize it, and downplay it. The more we can let our mate that we hurt into our own grieving process, the more they're allowed to grieve, and the more they trust us. Because now we're no longer the betrayer. Mm-hmm. Now we're somebody who's helping them heal. Now we're being a healing resource for them. Mm-hmm. And so...
And I can imagine that's really, really hard to do, because, it's the opposite of what we think we want to do.
Well, you think when you...
I'll just make it go away.
Well, yeah, people think that, but it didn't work. Because this is we're talking about major trauma. Mm. And so, oftentimes the one who has the affair feels like they should, sometimes they feel like, it's very often they feel like they don't have a right to talk about their feelings. It's all about you. I did this to you. But again, like I was saying, it's helpful to share your experiences of grieving, what I did to you, and how I feel stupid about what I did. Because that actually helps them heal. There's other research that shows that that's actually helpful in helping the one who's been injured heal, is when the one who was involved, who strayed, can be vocal and talk about that. And so the one who had the affair, what the research shows, and I can definitely attest to this, is there's a sense of loss that they have as well. And it's really about themselves. Like, how did I ever allow myself to do this to my partner? How could I do this? I thought I was a good person. How did I lose my way? How did I justify this in my mind that I could do this to somebody I care about? And so, or who am I? I never thought I could do such a thing. There's often feelings of guilt and shame that really come to be experienced as almost this unshakable thing that they have. Just, who am I? How could I do this?
Almost like a shame spiral.
Well, I think people who really get stuck in really unproductive shame to the point that they want to relieve the relationship, oftentimes or maybe still hiding something. When people have this shame that
they stay stuck in,
I think oftentimes they're hiding something.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of shame, but I think people, because if you can't, that's just what I've seen. I could go on and talk about that.
That's another show, right? By itself.
And so there's often a sense of loss for the involved partner, the one who had the affair, regarding the future of the marriage too. We've talked about that in our 7 stages of affair recovery, that ambiguity. There's a feeling of uncertainty, especially concerning whether the hurt partner will ever be able to forgive them and allow the one who had the affair a continued place in his or her life. So they're grieving that. Mm-hmm. Like, can you look at me the same way again? Can you forgive me? Mm-hmm. Can you trust me again? Can we have a life together? The one who had the affair is often grieving that. Mm-hmm. And honestly, the more you're able to talk about that, the more it will help. You guys are kind of noticing a trend in what I'm saying here. The more you guys can talk about this together, the more you're going to be able to heal the grief process. Mm-hmm. And as we can be both co-comforters, we're going to be able to begin to be both co-healers as well and work through this grieving process. And we do this, let me say this, Morgan, we do this by talking from a very vulnerable place, not out of our anger, not out of our frustration. There's going to be tons of anger. There's going to be tons of frustration. We're going to want to attack, but we have to do it from a vulnerable place. Really where we're talking from the depth of our heart. And the terrible part about that is that's very hard for couples to do. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we're available. If you want to work with us, we're here to work with you. And so the involved partner also at times, some people, I wouldn't say everybody's this way, but definitely if they've experienced like a romantic affair, or they've experienced limerence, that love sickness or love addiction to that person, people oftentimes will begin to grieve the loss of that relationship. If they felt like they could depend on that person emotionally without it necessarily being limerence, they may grieve that because they're going to feel like this was I couldn't talk to my spouse. We've had issues for a long time, and now I've turned to this other person. I don't know how to. I've lost them because I want to stay married, because I do value my mate. It's who I really wanted to talk to, but I didn't know how to talk to them. Mm-hmm. And now I could talk to the affair partner. It was mainly, it wasn't really about sex. It was just somebody that I feel understood by. I've lost that now, and so there's this grief of I'm going to be alone. Mm. Can we really turn our marriage around? And that's part of the one who was involved in the affair. They have their own trust issues too. Mm. And so,
can I fix this? Can we be better?
Yeah, and that can be experienced as a trauma as well for the one who had the affair. Yeah. And so, I'm just kind of looking at the time. Morgan, I want to go through the 5 stages of grief. We're talking about grieving, but psychologists have identified that there's actually 5 stages of grieving. We got this from grief.com, so you can go to grief.com and look at this, and it's talking about. We're going to kind of read this, but we're going to change out where it talks about somebody passing away to the relationship passing.
So it's like death to the marriage,
or
relationship,
what you thought you had.
Yeah.
And so, Morgan, do you want to go?
Sure.
Kind of the first one, I think, is denial.
Yeah. So the first one's denial. Denial is the first of the 5 stages of grief. It helps us to survive the loss. It kind of protects us, right? In this stage, the world becomes meaningless and overwhelming. Life makes no sense. We're in a state of shock and denial, so we go numb to kind of protect ourselves. We wonder how we can go on, if we can go on, why we should go on. So we ask all of those questions, those internal questions. We try to find a way to simply get through each day to sort of exist, right? Denial and shock help us to cope and make survival possible. So denial helps us to pace our feelings of grief so they don't overwhelm us. So we're pacing ourselves. And there is a grace in denial. So it's like a grace period. It is nature's way of letting in only as much as we can handle. So as you accept the reality of the loss and start to ask yourself questions, you are unknowingly beginning the healing process. So and why did this happen? Who am I? Who is this person? Like, we're starting to make sense of the situation, of the betrayal, of who we are, right? So that we can start that healing process. So you're becoming stronger, and the denial is beginning to fade. So you're going to step into the next stage. But as you proceed, all the feelings you were denying, they begin to resurface. They begin to surface, which is normal because you can't suppress those feelings forever.
Yeah. And so, you're just kind of keeping a lid on it.
Right.
And I like that description of how denial is nature's way of allowing us to only experience what we can at that moment.
Right.
And
because it's so overwhelming. It can be so overwhelming to the senses. We're shocked. We're all over the map a lot of times. And so if we can sort of protect, like our subconscious mind can sort of protect us from kind of losing it, I think denial is kind of the way it does that.
Yeah, or losing it more, because oftentimes we lose it big time when we go through this.
Absolutely.
So anger, and so let me say this, these kind of work in a spiral fashion. It's not like you jump from denial, then you go to anger, then you go to depression, then you go to acceptance. Like,
it's not a clean...
Yeah, it's not a clean thing like that. It's kind of a spiral. You'll go from denial to anger, maybe back to denial, to anger, to bargaining, to depression, to acceptance. You just kind of go round and round. And so the next stage in this is anger. Anger is a necessary stage of the healing process. That's good news because there's usually a lot of anger after we've been betrayed. And so if there's a lot of anger, realize it's actually necessary that we get through this, that we experience that anger, because that's part of the healing. And so anger is a necessary stage of the healing process. Be willing to feel your anger, even though it may seem endless. I think it's an important point because oftentimes people feel like it's wrong to be angry. Even about this, I shouldn't be angry.
It's a negative emotion.
Yeah, it's a negative emotion. Like, a lot of people have never really experienced anger. Others in the past, it's okay to be angry about this. It's okay to let yourself feel the anger. The more you truly feel the anger, the more it begins to dissipate, and the more you will heal. So the more that you try to suppress your anger, the less you're actually holding yourself back from healing. So people have to feel their anger. And one of the things I'll do in the office, Morgan, is there's two types of anger. There's a primary anger, which is about being violated. And then there is a secondary anger, which is more about punishing a person. And I'll help people oftentimes try to help them express that primary anger, because it has to be expressed for people to really heal. There are many other emotions under the anger, and you're going to get to them in time. But anger is the emotion we are most used. That's the anger that we're used to managing the most.
Right.
The truth is that anger really has no limits. It can extend not only to friends, your therapist, your family, yourself, your loved one who committed the affair, but also to God. You may ask, where's God in this? Underneath anger is pain, and that's your pain. It is natural to feel deserted and abandoned, but we live in a society that fears anger. Anger is actually a strength, and it can be an anchor, giving temporary structure to the nothingness of loss. I think I like how they said that, because when we're angry, it causes us to take action. There's only certain things that I've done because I got really angry, and things that maybe put off. It causes us to do something. And when we express anger, it helps us to really grow.
Absolutely.
And so, at first, grief feels like being lost at sea, no connection to anything. Then you get angry at someone, maybe a person who knows about your situation, but who's not being supportive, who's not being around to help you in times of needs. Maybe a person who's different, who's different now that they know about what's happened in your marriage. Suddenly you have a structure, you can turn your anger towards them. The anger becomes a bridge over the open sea, a connection from you to them is something to hold on to, and a connection made from the strength of anger feels better than nothing. We usually know more about suppressing anger than feeling it. The anger is just another indication of the intensity of your love. So the more angry we are, that's an important point. The more angry we are, the deeper the love has been.
Yeah.
Sometimes people, I've worked with some where people get betrayed. There's really no anger about it.
Right.
It's like, you know what? I could have done it too, and they just choose to divorce because there's no real connection in the relationship.
Yeah.
So that anger is it's kind of a barometer of the depth of love that we've experienced.
Yeah, and another thing that came to mind as you were reading that too is whenever we can express those feelings, it's helpful because we're vocalizing what's going on, and people can understand that, right? They can understand. So, like, if you are seeking help or comfort, like, if you're just suppressing the anger, more than likely you're being quiet or you're avoiding, and no one knows what's really happening for you in that moment. No one knows how to really help you or, I guess, support you. But if you are vocalizing the anger, then people, can draw closer to you and help you because they can hear what's going on.
Yeah. And here's the thing. Experiencing anger, expressing anger is not about verbal abuse, emotional abuse, destroying your mate. If you're planning on staying with them, you don't want to express, emotional. It's so easy to do that. You don't want to abuse them. That's a good way to get stuck in the negative cycle. But there is ways to let yourself experience anger in safe ways. There's ways to do that.
Right.
But you have to do it in safe ways.
Absolutely.
Because if you direct it towards your mate and you're abusing them emotionally, but then you're also expecting them to be there for you, that ain't going to happen.
Right.
You can't unleash your anger on them and then expect them to be there for you emotionally. It just doesn't happen.
Absolutely. So then we have bargaining. And so it says before a loss, which maybe even before the affair was discovered or betrayal was discovered, it seems like you will do anything if only your loved one would be spared or if your relationship would be spared. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of bargaining. You're like, okay, so if only we could go back to the way it was, then, we're sort of like bargaining, right? Mm-hmm. And so, if you're talking to God and you say, please, God, you bargain, I'll never be angry again with my spouse. If you just will help me get through this, or if you'll just help us heal this relationship, I'll change, I'll do something different. But after infidelity or after the betrayal or after, things go sour, bargaining may take the form of a temporary truce. So what if I devote the rest of my life to helping, others or doing X or Y or Z for my spouse or my family? Then can I wake up and realize that all of this was just a bad dream, right? So we become lost in a maze of if only or what if statements, and that's a big deal. So we want life return to what it was, but oftentimes in a relationship that's found its way to infidelity, what was before was part of the problem, and we don't really want to go back there. We like to go back before it started hurting and the pain was there, but truly what was there wasn't something that we really want. We want something different. We want something new. We want something better. So we want our loved one restored, but we want our relationship restored, but we want something better. So we want to go back in time, fix things, recognize things, stop.
Recognize the problem sooner.
Right, recognize the problem sooner, maybe prevent it from happening. And we can't go back, but we can move forward and we can change things. Do you have something to say about that?
Well, guilt is often bargaining's companion, where we often say if only.
Oh, if only, right, yeah. And we talk a lot about that in previous episodes that we've done. So the if onlys cause us to find fault in ourselves and what we think we could have done differently. And so we may even bargain with the pain. We will do anything not to feel the pain of the loss. We remain in the past trying to negotiate our way out of the hurt. And people often think of the stages as lasting weeks or months. They forget that the stages are responses to feelings that can last for minutes or hours as we flip in and out of one and the other. It's kind of like we were talking about. There's not really a linear process. You could feel one way at one moment and then the other way another moment and sort of move in and out. So we don't enter and leave each individual stage in a linear fashion is what they're saying. Yeah. So we may feel one and then another kind of back to back. So that's very true for this scenario where we're grieving, what we hoped our relationship would be. And so the nice thing about what we have now is we can actually go and create something brand new. We really don't want what was the old. We don't really want what was before the betrayal or before things went bad, because a lot of what we had was actually, you know, a cause or part of what caused what we have now. And so we can create something new, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. The fourth stage that we'll cover is depression. And after bargaining, our attention moves squarely into the present because we realize, you know what? If those if onlys aren't going to happen anymore, I'm not going to get those second chances. So then we become depressed. And you know, so empty feelings present themselves, and grief enters our mind really at a deeper level than we had before, and it happens deeper than we ever imagined. So this depressive stage feels as though it will last forever. Depression is an appropriate response to a great loss. We withdraw from life. We're left in a fog of intense sadness, we're wondering, like, is there any point to going on at all? You know, is there any point at all, like, being in this relationship with you? You cheated on me. Is there any point of going on alone at all in this thing? Depression after a loss is too often seen as unnatural. We feel like it's a state to be fixed, something to snap out of. The first question to ask yourself is whether or not the situation you're in is actually depressing. Obviously, with infidelity, it probably is. The loss of when somebody passes away, that's obviously a very depressing situation. And depression is a normal and appropriate response. To not experience depression after a loved one dies would be unusual. I would say the same with infidelity. It's, to not experience depression after a loved one has an affair or after we have an affair would be a very unusual response. And so to not experience depression after those things happen is unusual. When a loss fully settles in our soul, the realization that our mate didn't get better, that they cheated on us, and that this is going to be hard work to repair this, is understandably depressing. If grieving is a process of healing, then depression is one of the many steps along the way. And let me say this too, Morgan, before we go on to acceptance, and then we'll be done.
After we answer the question.
Yeah, we got to answer the question. But depression is an appropriate response to trauma.
Right.
And so, depression is a normal part of grieving, whether it's the loss of a job, no matter what it is, it's an appropriate response. But I don't want to minimize the trauma impact of this and the PTSD symptoms of this. Like, you need to see a trauma therapist if you've been betrayed. You need to see somebody who specializes in EMDR or brain spotting. You need to figure that out because it's going to help with the depression, it's going to help you grieve, and it's going to help with the PTSD symptoms. It's not going to automatically create trust in your relationship, but it's something you need to do. Morgan, you want to finish up with acceptance?
Yeah, and just briefly, we remove the pain and the sadness from that memory is with that trauma.
It helps us,
We can talk about that another time. Now, so we talk about the fifth stage, acceptance. Acceptance is often confused with the notion of being all right or okay with what happened, right? So this is not the case. Many people or most people don't ever feel okay or all right about the loss of their relationship, right? This stage is about accepting the reality that our relationship is gone, that the relationship has changed. It is no longer what it used to be.
We're in marriage 2.0 now.
Yeah, marriage 2.0, absolutely. And recognizing that this new reality is the permanent reality, which honestly I think is much better. If you do it right, you're gonna be so much happier and so much better, because it's going to be marriage 2.0 is way better than marriage 1.0. So we'll never like that we went through this, and we'll never be like okay that it happened, but we're going to be much better off and much happier. So we learn to sort of not just live with it, but accept that it happened, and then we're able to kind of move forward. So it's the new norm that we're moving into that we need to live with, and so we must try to live now in a world where our loved one is different. Our relationship is different. And I think we can, because it'll be much better, especially if you get the right help. And so you don't want to resist the process. I think resisting the process of taking it from marriage 1.0 to 2.0 is where the difficulty comes in. Like it's like birthing a new relationship. And And sometimes it's hard. And because like of the depression and because of the bargaining, all of these things that you go through, the stages of recovery, it's it's painful. It's painful. And so this new norm is something to get used to, but it definitely is worth it. And so, let me see, in time, through bits and pieces of acceptance and going through the process of kind of birthing Marriage 2.0, we see that we cannot maintain the past. Like we cannot do what we did in the past,
The old negative cycle,
That's
the
right.
old rules of the marriage.
Right, and
how we did it.
Albert Einstein says the same thinking that got us in trouble is not the thinking that will get us out of trouble. Like we have to change.
The way we saw it beforehand that got us into trouble
Right.
is not going to be the same level of perception or thinking that's going to get us out of trouble.
So I guess the difference between like death of a loved one, where they are literally gone, versus like the death of the relationship is that there's much more joy in this new relationship. As you heal and move forward, like you can keep the relationship intact in a new sort of way that, if they've passed or something like that, you can't do.
Morgan, I want to say this. Part of acceptance is, we're making a new connection with our mate. We're making a new meaningful relationship. We're becoming really interdependent.
Yes.
Not independent of each other, but interdependent. And instead of denying our feelings, we listen to our needs and our mate's needs. We we're growing, we're changing, we're evolving. Really what we're doing is we're beginning the post-traumatic growth process that we talked about. And but to get to post-traumatic growth, you've got to go through this grieving process.
Right. And so those new hopes, it's a new hope in the relationship. So if you think of hope as expectations, you had these old expectations that are not going to be fulfilled for some reason, for whatever reason. Now you have this opportunity to create new expectations and new hopes for the relationship, and it takes some time. It takes effort, obviously, but at least you have this opportunity, and it kind of leads me to the question.
So we'll get to the question, but that's kind of it on the grief.
Yeah.
And so those are kind of my experiences, research, and then what grief experts say from grief.com, what they have to say about the 5 stages of grief.
Yeah.
Morgan, this question is how do you know when it's time to move on after several of these transgressions? I think that's different for everybody. I think that's a very individualistic decision. It's not fair for me to say you need to stick it out. But I think it's something that you really have to do some soul searching on. And I think definitely going after therapy.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of factors in that. I think people tend to be happier when they're together, but you got to get help, and you've got to really, try. I don't know your situation. I'm speaking very generally, and so I think.
And something that's really you just said that you've got to try, and maybe their partner doesn't know how. Like that's the thing is. We think, well, they're just not trying. Well, they just don't care. But really, they may not have the resources or the skills or the know-how to do that. And so we may have this impression or this, belief about them or what they're doing or not doing. But unless you both get the help for the relationship for yourself, how do we know if they're trying, if they don't know how to try?
Yeah. And honestly, that's above my pay grade to tell somebody that to leave a relationship. I think you... Really, well, to truly have closure on a relationship, I think you have to know you've really tried.
Yeah.
And I think that's the only way we can get closure and live without regrets is to know that we really tried. And I'm all for people working it out. I think people are happier when they're able to work it out. I do think for most people, there is more of a downside to not working out on a relationship after an affair and just divorcing. I think a lot of people, I think there's a lot more downside to that. I think especially if children are involved, I think children lose a lot if mom and dad aren't able to work it out. This is a shocking fact. This is not me pulling up some number out of my butt. This is actually research. I learned this actually in January. I'm surprised this isn't more talked about than it is. It says that it's from John Gottman. He's a marital researcher up in Seattle, and what he said is that folks who people who divorce, who go through a divorce, they are going through a divorce, not necessarily the infidelity that goes before, before a divorce or things like that, but people who actually divorce, and what you have to go through in the post-divorce adjustments that you make. He says that people who divorce, on average, live 7 years shorter. You take 7 years off your lifespan just by divorcing. And he's not even talking about the crap that goes on before a divorce. And so a lot of people still experience the same crap and same mess before a divorce, but through the help of therapy, working with folks like us, we're able to save the marriage, salvage the marriage. And so just by going through a divorce, you're shaving 7 years off your life.
Now, did he say that for the kids as well?
Yeah, and that's the other point I want to get to. He said that for adults, but he also said that for people for children, because it's so stressful. There's so much, it's such a stressful experience. There's so much adrenaline in the body. It's such a stressful experience that it really impacts our nervous system. It really impacts our body. And it's not just that, the kids of divorce are impoverished and they're living with a single mom and they're going to grow up in poverty. Obviously, those things aren't helpful, but it's not just that. It's just what the stress does to our relationship. And so it's a lot more than
separating the physical assets. It's more like internally it does something to your body.
It does something to a person, yes. And so children, when they divorce, when their parents divorce, they're statistically, going to lose 7 years off their life. My parents divorced. Find out about this. It doesn't make you happy when you find out stuff like this. Okay, there goes 7 years off my life. And then other people, if they grew up in a divorced home where their parents divorced, and then if they divorce, it complicates things. And science is really beginning to understand this a lot better than we ever have. The mind-body connection, and just how trauma like this, and something that this will really, I'm not going to get into a lot of this. This might be a different podcast, but just the ACE study, the childhood adverse childhood experiences, the ACE study. There's about 10 things that people can go through that are listed on this questionnaire, and about 14% of the population has none of these. But the more that you have, the more likely you are to get cancer, the more likely you are to have serious health issues as you age. And it's not just that you go through these things and you're that you go through these things and that you learn bad eating habits. It's just what the stress does to your body when you experience trauma and what you go through, and so it shortens your life.
So it's like, the trauma of the infidelity, the trauma of betrayal, the trauma, whatever the trauma is to the relationship that causes you to contemplate divorce. We're sort of meeting that trauma with a new trauma, the trauma of divorce. So it's like trauma begets trauma. It's almost like, so you've got this trauma of the pain in the relationship, and then you sort of, it's almost like you're meeting bad with bad. So there's pain here and then there's pain here. So it's almost like it doesn't heal by divorcing. Like you don't actually, like you don't heal anything. You're just hurting even more.
Yeah, but if people... It's ultimately your decision.
Right. There's no shame in here.
It's ultimately your decision if you're going to stay or go.
Right.
I think
some people just can't avoid it.
And sometimes the decision is made for us, unfortunately.
Right.
But it's ultimately your decision. You know what's best for you. We're giving you guys resources and options, to work it out. I think you can. I think you'll be happier if you do than if you do divorce. Research shows that people are just as miserable as they were 5 years later after a divorce.
Yeah, and they also say, 6 months kind of leading up to the divorce is painful, and it's really hard to be productive and healthy. Mm-hmm. And then it's like a year after the divorce where it's like you're still trying to recover and figure out how to do life again. So it's like, I think the average was 2 years a divorce takes.
Let me just say this, and then we'll be done. I had a, occasionally, you know, because of infidelity, people fight more. They get in the negative cycles more. Sometimes children find out. Sometimes children, get hurt because they see mom and dad fighting. Maybe they're not doing as well socially and academically. Maybe they're just different. And so part of what happens is sometimes when we see our kid hurting after we've been trying to work it out, we kind of think, well, maybe we need a divorce. But the problem, in my experience with my parents' divorce, was with other kids is, it's the, it's yes, what mom and dad are doing now, they're not getting along well, is not going well. But if we're, if we're choosing to divorce because we think the kids are going to be better off for it, we have to realize that the whole, where a lot of people get messed up is in the post-divorce life. Kids typically go with mom. Mom's now a single mom who's not making as much money. Maybe the kids are poor. Something like 70% of dads after a divorce no longer have any contact with their kids, which is shocking. That's another number from the research from Gottman. And so, like 70% of kids after divorce no longer have their dad in their lives. And not just a weekend dad, it's like they don't see their dad at all. Like dad bills. And so that's where, divorce becomes, really, so it's like, oh, we're fighting in front of our kids, they're unhappy, they're seeing their school performances dropping, all these other things that happen socially to kids. But there's a whole load of crap that happens after divorce. And the people who, and I'm speaking just from my experience, the people in my office who grew up in divorce know that. And they're like, no. But the people who have their parents intact are the ones who are more like, oh, maybe we need a divorce. The people who grew up in a divorced home are like, heck no, we're not even going to approach this with a 10-foot pole because there's just so much on the other side of that. And so it just opens a can of worms. When my parents divorced, it was like being a refugee. Your dad's no longer in the picture. When he was, it was on the weekends. It was Disneyland dad. It was didn't pay child support. Mom had to work late just to make ends meet. Me and my brother were the last kids picked up from daycare. And it's just because she had to work. And so there's a lot of things that can happen. Kids are left alone. There's just so much more that happens that we don't have time to get into.
Yeah.
There's a lot to consider. And
right.
So it's not I'm not going to tell anybody to divorce. I'm going to encourage everybody to try to work it out because I believe there's a way to do it. I think anybody can turn it around. And I know just how deadly the other side is.
Right. So it's actually easier to work it out than it is to divorce.
Yes, absolutely.
And a lot less painful to work it out and to go through the healing process.
Yeah, and I think there are certain circumstances, I don't know what they are, and this is, Morgan, I've never wanted to answer this question in the podcast, and I'm talking about it, and I've never wanted to answer it in the podcast because so many people, if I make an exception, because so many of you guys trust me and listen to me and have listened to us for a long time now. If I ever make any sort of exception, like you can divorce for this, people always think that's them. And so it's like, so I don't like answering this question because people always think it's that we're making some exception. Like, and then I fit into that. Like, I've been traumatized. I'm grieving. I'm hurting. This is something I can never come back from. You'd be shocked at what you can do.
Yeah.
So we'll see you guys next time. Thank you for joining us.
Yep, for this very serious episode. Have a great night, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Healing Broken Trust podcast. Are you ready to take the next step? Go to healingbrokentrust.com and schedule your one-on-one coaching call today. That's healingbrokentrust.com.